Recruiting and retaining librarians of color in New Hampshire public libraries. Hello, I'm Laura Croft-Berry. I'm the director at the Langdon Public Library in Newington, New Hampshire. I'm also the Education Committee Chair of the NHLTA Board of Directors and an MLIS candidate for the year 2021 at San Jose State University online. In 2020, the George Floyd protests across our country prompted New Hampshire librarians to ask the questions, what can we do? And also, what do we need to change? In response, the New Hampshire Library Association formed an Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force with the goal of posing some answers to these questions. In fall of 2020, I was taking the course Info 244 Online Searching with the wonderful Professor Vicki Steiner. I wholeheartedly recommend her to anyone who takes the MLIS program at San Jose State. I had to do research on a topic of my choosing, and I chose diversity in New Hampshire libraries. It was part of the assignment to share with a client, and I chose the new NHLA EDI task force as the perfect client. My goal for this project was to find research-based approaches to diversifying New Hampshire libraries, both as workplaces and as public spaces. Before we go on to the suggestions I found, though, we need to discuss some of the barriers to diversity we'll contend with while doing this work. A few years ago, a coalition of employers in New Hampshire came together with the intent of learning how to better attract marginalized and minority employees. When the New York Times covered the event, the article drew negative attention nationally from Tucker Carlson on Fox News and locally in the Manchester Union Leader in an editorial. This quote appeared on social media from the New Hampshire Department of Education spokesman. "Diversity for diversity's sake doesn't bring us anything. We don't want or need New Hampshire to become any kind of cesspool." Worst of all, after the article came out, 2 Black attendees at the event, New Hampshire Black History Trail Executive President Jerry Ann Bogus and consultant and community activist Deo Muano, received anonymous threats. I imagine this story is shocking to a lot of people in New Hampshire. Most of us who live here or who grew up here, like me, think this state is a great place for anyone to live or grow up. What we may not realize is that's a racially typical experience. If you talk to people of color who live or grew up in New Hampshire, you may hear dramatically different stories. And this incident is a perfect example. None of the white attendees received death threats for participating in the coalition, even though white people initiated it and invited Bogus and Muano to participate. This is why we can't leave the job of diversifying our state up to people of color. It's a risk for them, it's not for us. But this also may be why librarians aren't doing it already. Death threats against participants, the New Hampshire Department of Education equating diversity initiatives with creating a cesspool, and controversial media coverage are all why New Hampshire library management may shy away from proactive, noticeable efforts to diversify libraries. Even if they support diversity, they may choose to avoid conflict with those who, like Anthony Chinella of the Department of Education, automatically assume the worst of people from other races. This is where organizations like NHLA and NHLTA need to provide support and resources to help lessen resistance, both in our libraries and in our towns. Progressive recruiting typically requires more work, more capital, and a lot more activity. This observation actually came from an article about diversifying fire departments. When looking for research in LIS literature about effective strategies for diversifying libraries, which, like New Hampshire, are very homogeneous, I found far more articles about how little progress we've made in the last 30 years since we started talking about it in our field. In a nutshell, the main reason we haven't made more progress is we're not recruiting. Looking at this slide, we can probably see right away why that's not happening in New Hampshire libraries, especially small ones. We have far too little time and money already, and progressive recruiting can be added to a long list of things we might want to do and think we should, but don't have the time or money. This becomes a sort of self-defeating loop that New Hampshire libraries can be caught in. A community that doesn't prioritize diversity is unlikely to provide adequate resources to facilitate diversity. However, being exposed to diversity by reading, attending workshops, and building relationships is what makes communities embrace diversity. If library staff doesn't demonstrate a commitment to diversity, the community will continue not to allocate resources for those efforts. It becomes a vicious cycle. Recognizing this can help librarians realize what they're up against and plan accordingly. While many of the following suggestions may not be possible to implement everywhere, some of them will be, and we have to start where we're at. So let's talk about effective recruitment strategies. These actually came from the fire department article. Fire departments are very homogeneous groups, much like New Hampshire and libraries. Fire departments are primarily white men, libraries are primarily white women, New Hampshire is primarily white people. So these suggestions are designed for groups that are homogeneous, not for places that are surrounded by diverse communities with a lot of resources handy to draw on. First of all, use current members to actively reach out and engage diverse communities. So this is when you have a member of one of those marginalized or minority groups working in your library, and they become the liaison for your library in that group. Even though this is an excellent way to recruit, I do want to caution you against putting people in that position. If they want to be in that position, if they let you know they want to, then it should absolutely be supported. But it is not their job to diversify New Hampshire libraries. And as we talked about earlier, this is a risk for them that it isn't for us. So we still should take that primary responsibility and just provide support if any of them want to do that. Okay, reach them early, well before the time of ordinary recruitment, and also create vocational training for high school seniors that prepares them to enter as pre-apprentices upon graduation. So this brings to mind for me that how some libraries have page positions in their libraries where the page will do some shelving and some basic library work, like maybe some circ desk responsibilities, and it's usually high school students that are hired for these, and sometimes go into library fields as a result later. While you can't advertise specifically for diverse candidates to fill these positions for obvious reasons, you can advertise where those diverse candidates might see the advertisement. So getting out of your normal circle and normal places to advertise, thinking about where you might put up that flyer that a high school student might see it, who is of a minority background or marginalized group, could bring you a candidate that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. Finally, build strong partnerships and take risks. We are probably underutilizing a lot of the organizations in our state that would allow us to build those relationships and have more access to people from minority groups. For example, while I pride myself on building relationships within my community in Newington, I am not as good at reaching outside. It is only very recently that I have started building a relationship with the New Hampshire Black History Trail and the Seacoast NAACP, even though those are organizations that are very active in my area. These recruitment strategies did come from an article in the LIS field called Diversity by Design, From Concept to Action. First of all, target recruiting from cultural centers on campuses. Along the lines of underutilizing community groups when building these relationships, libraries are also probably underutilizing campuses as well. If your library is anywhere near UNH, Plymouth State, Keene State, SNHU, or other community college or trade school in our state, I encourage you to reach out and offer support and resources to those minority students. Provide mentors from underrepresented groups. This is another thing I think is underutilized in New Hampshire. While I think there are a lot of informal mentorships in New Hampshire libraries, I would like to see formalized ones, not just for minority and marginalized candidates, but for any young or new librarian in the state that wants one. Job descriptions should include cultural and diversity competencies or qualifications. Ask who does this benefit when updating existing positions. I really like that "who does this benefit" question. A lot of times we promote from within in libraries, maybe from an initial position to a position of authority, or a part-time position to a full-time position. It's great to look critically at who is always getting those positions. Is it always people of the same demographics? And if so, is there a racist, prejudiced, sexist, or homophobic reason for that? If not, we still might want to look at this to be able to see, is there balance? Are there other things we are doing to promote people from other groups and not just the ones that primarily get the full-time or administrative or authoritarian positions? Include interview candidates about candidates' commitment to diversity. Sorry, I said that wrong. Include interview questions about candidates' commitment to diversity. This is not common in New Hampshire libraries either, and I think we should start. Acknowledge values-based diversity, i.e. problem-solving approaches, and diversity of thought. Be careful not to just perpetuate whiteness. I will come back to that one. Let's move on to effective retention strategies. So these actually came from an article that was a review of the literature in the last 5 to 10 years covering recruitment and retention strategies of underrepresented workers in the LIS field. So the first one is for library managers, we should assess our organization's climate. And I would add that we shouldn't just be assessing the climate of our own libraries, but of New Hampshire libraries at large, and also our state at large. Implement cultural competency trainings. If you're unfamiliar with the terms cultural competency or multicultural competence, now is a really good time to do some research on that. Provide mentors from underrepresented groups. We already talked about that, but I'm leaving it here to emphasize it. And on an individual level, we need to identify our own biases, listen to and believe others' lived experiences, and say something when we see others try and silence the voices of our colleagues. This is really important, and I want to talk about it for a minute because in all of what I've been reading, it happens a lot to anyone from an underrepresented group. So someone is telling a story about their experience of prejudice or bias, and someone else who's not from that same group responds and says, "Oh, that didn't really happen," or "You misinterpreted their intention of what they were saying." So now the person who has made themselves vulnerable by telling a story in which they were at best uncomfortable and at worst traumatized has now been told that they're wrong about that experience. We need to not do that to people. We also need to say something if we see someone else do it. So someone speaks up and then another person invalidates them. We need to speak up and say, "Oh, I think that really could have happened," or "I'd like to hear more about that because I think you're probably right." So we need to play that role, both be the person who is not saying the person saying the thing in the first place, but also the person who speaks up when we hear it. Another quotation that I found from this article that was really important is, throughout the application process, existing diversity initiatives may unintentionally recruit for whiteness. Perceived whiteness means that individuals feel it is necessary to edit or modify their behavior so they are not perceived as a threat to white identity. We don't talk a lot about whiteness in New Hampshire libraries, but we should. And the reason is we probably are experiencing it much like a fish experiences water but doesn't know the word water and couldn't describe it for you. Whiteness is a cultural norm that we, because we are part of the dominant majority, don't realize is racial. So a really good example of this is when we talk about finding someone who's a good fit in our workplace. Most of the time, when we are defining those community norms and workplace norms, they are much more racial than we realize. So we need to take a look at that and consider it whenever we are both writing job descriptions, doing an interview, and also just how we comport ourselves and what our expectations are of our employees. Finally, from an article called Hostile to Inclusive: Strategies for Improving the Racial Climate of Academic Libraries, all need to recognize there is a problem, read about the history, role, and forms of racial oppression to develop a deeper understanding of the pervasiveness and perniciousness of racism, seek out and promote writing by authors of color, including works of criticism or theory, literary works, or social media and blog posts. In addition to reading, white librarians should position themselves so that they are privy to frank discussions about race and racism by developing genuine relationships with people from other racial or ethnic backgrounds. And finally, commit to diversity initiatives. Implement diversity or multicultural competence trainings and discussions while making clear a one-time workshop will not be sufficient to undo the pervasive consequences of systemic racism. The last thing I want to talk about in this presentation is something I was completely unaware of myself before I started doing the research for this project. There has been a huge demographic shift in New Hampshire in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, in 1990, we were the 28th oldest state in the nation, meaning the median age of the population of New Hampshire was the 28th oldest. Today, we are the second oldest. That is a dramatic change in just 30 years. There are multiple factors of why this is happening, but one of the main ones is New Hampshire towns are increasingly incentivizing age-restricted housing. So we're seeing large increases in the number of retirees, 65 and older, who are coming to live in New Hampshire, while workers are leaving the state or not coming here at all because they can't find affordable housing. This has implications that can be disastrous to our state long term. And it's relevant to our topic of diversity in New Hampshire for a specific reason, which is that according to New Hampshire demographic analyst Peter Francis, young people across America are more diverse than older people. Among people under the age of 20, approximately half are of one minority group or another. So young people, by definition, are diverse. Older people are not as diverse. If you're unfamiliar with Peter Francis, I strongly encourage you to look up the documentaries and books, Communities and Consequences. There are two different ones. One of them came out in 2012, and one of them came out in 2020. And they are both all about this major demographic shift in New Hampshire and the implications of it. So since young people are more diverse than older generations, making New Hampshire more diversity friendly is a matter of urgency in the state, as well as in our field, and an opportunity for libraries to educate and raise awareness. That's the end of my presentation. I very much thank you for your time, and I hope this has been useful to you. If you have any questions for me, my email is director@langdonlibrary.org, and I'd be happy to hear from you.